December the 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning like countless others, yet it would end as a day that altered history forever. For President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it became the turning point when a fractured nation discovered its resolve, when isolationism perished in the inferno of Pearl Harbor, and when America's fate pivoted toward global leadership. But to grasp what Roosevelt truly knew that morning, what instinct stirred within him as the reports poured in, we must first understand the America that existed before the first bombs fell. By late 1941, the United States stood divided at a crossroads. Europe had been at war for more than 2 years. Hitler's armies dominated nearly the entire continent. Britain fought on alone. Its cities ravaged night after night, yet America clung to neutrality, weary, cautious, haunted by the memories of the Great War. 23 years had passed since American soldiers returned from France's trenches, and the nation had sworn never again. The America First Committee had become one of the largest political movements in U.S. history, counting over 800,000 members. Charles Lindbergh, the same aviation hero who had once crossed the Atlantic solo, now used his fame to argue that America must stay out of Europe's conflict.in towns and cities. People wore badges reading "Keep Us Out" and "America First." Mothers held their sons closer, remembering the 116,000 who never came home from the last war. Roosevelt saw further. Having served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, he understood what Hitler's victories foretold. He knew Britain's survival was America's survival, that the Atlantic Ocean was no longer the shield isolationists imagined. But democracy bound his hands that he had just won a third term in November 1940, after assuring the nation, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." He meant it sincerely, yet he knew events might one day force him to break that promise. So Roosevelt maneuvered carefully. He championed Lend-Lease, arming Britain without direct involvement. He ordered U.S. naval escorts to guard Atlantic convoys. He met Churchill of Newfoundland in August 1941, drafting the Atlantic Charter, their shared vision of a freer post-war world. He walked a political tightrope, doing everything short of open war while honoring the public's reluctance. Meanwhile, the Japanese dilemma deepened. For years, Japan had waged brutal conquests in China, and by 1941 it set its sights on Southeast Asia's rich colonies. Lands left vulnerable by Europe's struggle against Hitler, Roosevelt struck back economically. Freezing Japanese assets and cutting off oil supplies. It was a bold, deliberate gamble, one that would soon bring unimaginable consequences. Designed to contain Japan's aggression without provoking open conflict. But in Tokyo, the military elite viewed the sanctions as a death sentence. Without American oil, Japan's empire and navy would collapse within months. The choice was stark: surrender to U.S. demands and abandon expansion, or strike swiftly before strangulation became certain. During the autumn of 1941, Japanese diplomats still talked peace in Washington, even as their armed forces secretly prepared for war. Intelligence hints reached Roosevelt, decoded intercepts, unusual movements, messages that spoke of tension and urgency. American cryptographers had cracked Japanese diplomatic ciphers. What they read confirmed something ominous, but the meaning was lost in a sea of uncertainty. Where would Japan strike? The Philippines seemed probable, perhaps Malaya, Singapore, or the Dutch East Indies. The Pacific was vast, its possibilities endless. Few believed Pearl Harbor, 4,000 miles from Japan, was in danger. The great Hawaiian base, home to the Pacific Fleet, was thought safe by sheer distance. Theoretically, carrier-based planes could reach it, but it would be madness, a suicide raid, surely detected long before arrival. No rational commander would attempt such folly. They were wrong. On November 26, 1941, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led 6 aircraft carriers from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. Radio silence was absolute as the fleet slipped east through the empty northern Pacific, on a route chosen to avoid all detection. Aboard the carriers, pilots drilled, prayed, and waited. They now knew their objective, Pearl Harbor. They also knew the odds. Many did not expect a return. In Washington, Roosevelt spent that final Saturday of peace at the White House, still hoping diplomacy might succeed. On December 6, Navy intelligence intercepted a 13-part message from Tokyo. Roosevelt read it quietly that evening and told his aide, Harry Hopkins, "This means war. But where? When?" The note severed negotiations but gave no target, no time. Meanwhile, across the dateline, dawn approached. Nagumo's task force had reached its launch point, 230 miles north of Oahu.in. Darkness. Japanese flight crews armed torpedoes fitted with wooden fins still run in Pearl Harbor shallow waters. Bombs were loaded engines warmed, and pilots gathered for final briefings. At 1:30 a.m. in Washington, 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii, the first wave of 183 aircraft lifted off. They assembled in the pale light, heading south toward their unsuspecting prey. The element of surprise was total. Roosevelt slept, unaware that history was about to pivot. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, 1 p.m. in Washington, Commander Mitsu Fukaida, leading the assault, looked down at the placid harbor below. Battleships lay neatly moored, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, no fighters in the sky. No warning sounded. He radio decoded triumph. Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 signifying complete surprise. Moments later, the planes plunged through broken clouds toward Pearl Harbor. Clouds. Torpedo bombers skimmed the surface. Barely above the waves, dive bombers shrieked downward from the sky, and high-altitude bombers released their loads from thousands of feet above. The first explosion tore through Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. In Washington, President Roosevelt sat in his study, sorting through his stamp collection. One of his rare pastimes at IT was a quiet Sunday. Many officials were home, the Capitol calm and unhurried. At 1:47 p.m. The phone rang. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox spoke quickly, his voice tight with urgency. A message from Hawaii. Short, chilling, air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Roosevelt's face went pale. He pressed for answers, for confirmation. Knox had few details, only fragments of horror. The president hung up and began calling everyone, ordering Knox to the White House, summoning Secretary of State Cordell Hull and the Joint Chiefs. Within minutes, the quiet mansion turned into a nerve center war. As the reports poured in, the magnitude of the disaster unfolded. Battleship Row burned. The Arizona had exploded. The Oklahoma had overturned. The West Virginia and California were sinking. Hundreds were dead, maybe thousands. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield in the Pacific, was being annihilated. Roosevelt listened, unflinching, his jaw set behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He fired precise questions. Casualties, salvage, second strikes. His trademark optimism was gone. The strategist had taken over. Calm, analytical, relentless. Even amid the catastrophe, Roosevelt grasped one hard truth, one he could never say aloud. That day Pearl Harbor had, in a brutal instant, resolved his greatest political dilemma. For 2 years, he had watched Hitler's forces ravage Europe while America argued over intervention. He had seen the Blitz photographs, the intelligence on Nazi crimes, the warnings about global tyranny. He had wanted to act, to awaken America's power, but democracy itself restrained him. Now, everything had shifted. Japan had struck without warning on a Sunday morning. While its diplomats still posed as peacemakers, they had slaughtered Americans without a declaration of war. It was, as Roosevelt would later say, a date which will live in infamy. And that infamy united the nation. WWII evening, the White House brimmed with cabinet members, generals, and congressmen. No council hesitation. There were no more debates about neutrality. The mood was iron-cold resolve, fury that transcended party lines. Republicans and Democrats, isolationists and interventionists alike, were now one voice. America would fight. And interventionists alike reacted as one. This was no distant European conflict, no foreign entanglement to be avoided. This was an assault on American soil, upon American servicemen, by an enemy that struck without warning, without mercy, without honor. Senator Arthur Vandenborg, once a staunch isolationist, heard the news over his radio. Within hours, his years of opposition to intervention dissolved completely. The America First Committee, that once powerful force in neutrality, collapsed within days, its mission obliterated like the ships in Pearl Harbor. Even Charles Lindbergh, who had so passionately argued against involvement, conceded, "We have been attacked. It is useless to debate whether we should have entered the war. We are in it, and we must fight to win." Across the nation, the response was immediate and unanimous. Families crowded around radios, faces pale and resolute. As reports poured in from Hawaii, men queued outside recruiting stations before dawn Monday. Factories pledged overtime. Women organized drives for war bonds and supplies. In a single night, America's divisions melted into purpose. Roosevelt did not sleep that night. He met with advisers, drafted statements, prepared his address to Congress. He weighed every word, knowing this speech would not only announce war, but shape how history remembered the day early drafts read, a date which will live in world history. His aide Harry Hopkins suggested one change, world history to infamy. Roosevelt nodded. Infamy captured a moral outrage of betrayal and deceit. At 12:30 p.m. on December 8, Roosevelt entered the House chamber. Leaning on his son James, a Marine officer, his polio-bound legs made him appear fragile, but as he gripped the podium, his presence filled the room. Every seat was taken. The galleries overflowed. Millions listened by radio. He looked out at Congress, the justices, the generals, and began, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. His voice was steady, grave, controlled. For 6 minutes, he recounted the treachery, the attack launched while Japan still spoke of peace, the simultaneous strikes on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and midway he described the losses, the dead, the deliberate invasion threatening the Pacific. Then came a line he had long been waiting to speak. I asked that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Thunderous applause erupted. Within an hour, both chambers voted overwhelmingly, 82-0 in the Senate, 388-1 in the House. Only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, lifelong pacifist, dissented. The United States was now at war, unified, resolute, unbreakable. 3 days later, Adolf Hitler made Roosevelt's mission complete by declaring war on America. The president's fears of how to rally the nation against fascism vanished. Hitler had done it for him. The Axis had made the conflict global, and Roosevelt now possessed what he had lacked for 2 long years, a united people, a just cause, and a mobilized giant ready to fight. The cost of awakening had been immense, but out of the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose transformation. America's vast industries shifted from cars to tanks, from tractors to bombers. Silent shipyards thundered with new life. Within months, the U.S. was producing more weapons than all Axis powers combined. Millions enlisted. Men trained in new camp from coast to coast, women filled factories and shipyards, building the tools of victory. Every town, every home, every heart turned toward total war. Roosevelt directed it all. The grand strategist of democracy. He worked with Churchill to shape Allied plans, urged his generals to strike boldly, negotiated with Stalin an uneasy alliance. He became the indispensable leader of the free world, the architect of the Grand Alliance. And none of it would have happened without that single morning. December the 7th, 1941. Without Pearl Harbor, America might have watched the world collapse from a distance, its ideals intact but its influence lost. Roosevelt had known war was inevitable, but he could not impose it. He needed something to unify the people, to turn hesitation into purpose. Pearl Harbor did that, in the most tragic way imaginable. From destruction came determination, from loss, resolve, and from the flames of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt forged the America that would go on to save the world.